The wind-up here doesn't howl. It starves. It strips the warmth from your bones before you even realize you're shivering. I didn't hike to her cabin looking for romance. I went because her chimney was dead, and digging a grave for a frozen neighbor is miserable, back-breaking work. The frost had set in hard by the second week of November. Up on Bitterroot Ridge, winter didn't announce itself with a gentle dusting of white. It arrived like a creditor, violent and demanding, turning the mud to iron and the pine needles to brittle glass. I was walking the high timberline, checking a string of marten traps that had yielded nothing but frozen bark and frustration for 3 days. My right knee held a dull, throbbing ache, a souvenir from a frightened pack mule 10 years back that always flared when the barometric pressure dropped. The sky was the color of a worn lead bullet. Snow was coming, heavy snow. I stopped at the edge of the granite overhang and looked down into the draw. Jasmine's place sat in the hollow, a haphazard arrangement of lodgepole pine and split-shake shingles that her late husband, Albert, had thrown together 5 years ago. Albert had been a valley man. He thought a mountain cabin was just a valley house built higher up. He didn't notch his corners deep enough. He didn't double chink the windward walls. The mountain took his ignorance and turned it into lung fever, burying him under a cairn of river rock 3 springs ago. Now there was just Jasmine. I watched her for a long time. From a distance, she looked like a shadow moving against the gray earth. There was no smoke rising from her stone chimney. That was what stopped me. A dead flue in this weather meant a dead hearth, and a dead hearth meant the cold was already inside, curling up in the corners of the room. I adjusted the leather strap of my rifle and started the descent. The grade was steep, choked with deadfall and scree, but I took it fast. I didn't care much for people, mostly because people required conversation, and conversation usually led to someone wanting something they hadn't earned. But there was a baseline law of the high country. You didn't let a neighbor freeze. Not if you could help it. As I broke through the timberline and stepped into her clearing, the rhythmic, pathetic sound of a dull blade hitting wet wood echoed against the trees. Thwack. Pause. Thwack. Pause. She was standing by the wood block, wrestling with a round of green ponderosa. She wore a heavy canvas coat that had belonged to Albert. It hung off her shoulders like a tent, the sleeves rolled up past the wrists to expose forearms wrapped in faded gray wool. Her hands were bare, the knuckles split and bleeding in the dry cold. She swung the hatchet again. It bounced off the pine, taking a meager sliver of bark with it. The blade was so dull, it wouldn't have cut hot butter. She didn't hear me approach over the crunch of the frost. I stopped about 10 feet away and just watched. She swung again, missed the center, and buried the hatchet into the side of the block. She let go of the handle, dropped her head, and let out a long, ragged breath that materialized in the freezing air. "You're trying to cut green wood with a spoon, Jasmine," I said. She jumped, spinning around. Her hand instinctively went to the pocket of the coat, likely where she kept a revolver, before she recognized me. Her shoulders dropped. "Gideon," she said, her voice raspy from the cold. "You make a habit of creeping up on women in the middle of nowhere? Only when they're making a racket." I walked past her, unlooping the heavy, long-handled splitting maul I kept tied to my pack. I didn't wait for an invitation. I grabbed the handle of her hatchet, yanked it free of the block, and tossed it into the dirt. "Hey," she protested, stepping forward. "I was using that." "No, you were fighting it, and losing." I kicked the round of ponderosa off the block and reached for a seasoned piece of oak from the bottom of her meager pile. I set it upright. "Go inside, you're shivering." I can chop my own wood. Her pride was a rigid, jagged thing. I respected it, but I didn't have the patience to coddle it. "I'm sure you can, but right now you aren't. And if you freeze to death, the marshal from Oakhaven is going to make me haul your body down the mountain, and my mules are already tired. Go inside." She stood her ground for a moment, her jaw set tight. She had a sharp face, weathered by the wind, with pale blue eyes that looked like cracked ice. She was 45, maybe 46, but the high country ages a woman differently. It strips away the softness and leaves only the architecture of the bone. She was hard and worn and deeply beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with youth. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the cabin, the heavy door groaning on its hinges before snapping shut behind her. I went to work. I widened my stance, feeling the familiar, grounding shift of my weight. I brought the maul up and let it fall. The head bit into the oak with a sharp, echoing crack. The wood split clean in two. I tossed the halves aside, set up another round, and swung again. There is a mindless rhythm to splitting wood. It's a physical math. The angle of the swing, the velocity of the iron, the reed of the wood grain. I sank into the work, letting the exertion build a furnace in my chest. The cold air burned my lungs, but my skin flushed hot under my flannel. For 2 hours, I didn't stop. I took the twisted, knotty pine she had been struggling with and drove the maul through it, forcing the iron wedge into the stubborn grain until it gave way with a groan. I chopped until my shoulders burned, and the pile of split logs was taller than my waist. The sky was darkening, bleeding into a deep, bruised purple. The first flakes of snow began to fall, tiny and dry, clicking against the dead leaves like grains of sand. I buried the maul into the block, wiped the sweat from my brow with the back of a grimy leather glove, and started stacking the wood against the sheltered side of her porch. The cabin door creaked open. Jasmine stood in the threshold. She had taken off the oversized coat. "You've been at it for 2 hours," she said quietly. "Wood doesn't chop itself. Come inside, I made coffee." I looked at the woodpile, then at the sky, calculating the time it would take to hike back to my own ridge. The wind was picking up, carrying the bitter promise of a serious squall. "All right," I said. I knocked the snow off my boots against the porch rail and stepped into the dim warmth of her home. The inside of Jasmine's cabin smelled of old wood smoke, dried sage, and isolation. It was a single, large room. A heavy iron stove sat in the center, radiating a meager heat. Albert had built the place too large, thinking of space rather than warmth. A high ceiling in the mountains is just a place for heat to hide while the floor freezes your feet. I unbuttoned my coat and hung it on a wooden peg by the door. I left my hat on. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I walked to the rough-hewn table near the stove. The chinking between the logs near the window was crumbling, letting in a draft that made the oil lamp on the table flicker. Jasmine was at the stove, pouring dark, thick liquid into 2 battered tin cups. "Stove's drawing poorly," I noted, looking at the thin wisp of smoke curling out from the cast iron door. "Flue is choked with creosote. I haven't had the reach to clean it out," she said, her back to me. She walked over and set a cup down in front of me. She took the seat opposite, wrapping her split red hands around her own tin cup to siphon its heat. I took a sip, The coffee was atrocious. It tasted like scorched dirt, copper, and desperation. She had likely boiled the same grounds 3 times over to stretch her rations. I didn't grimace. I just swallowed it down and took another drink. "It's terrible, I know," she said, watching my face. "I've had worse." "Where? In a prison?" A short, dry laugh escaped my chest before I could stop it. "Down in a mining camp outside of Leadville. Cook used to throw eggshells and pine needles into the pot to make it stretch. This is slightly better." She smiled. It was a small, fractured thing, but it changed her face entirely. It pushed the weariness back for a fleeting second. We sat in silence for a few minutes. The only sound was the wind beginning to throw itself against the eastern wall of the cabin and the quiet popping of the dry oak I had brought in, finally catching in the belly of the stove. I looked at her hands. The knuckles were raw, the cuticles cracked and dark with ingrained soil. They were the hands of a woman who was fighting a war of attrition against the earth and losing. "You've got enough wood to last a month if you keep the drafts plugged," I said, breaking the quiet. "But you need meat and flour. You're running lean, Jasmine." She stiffened, pulling her hands away from the cup and folding them in her lap. The pride was back, rigid as a board. "I'll manage. The town factor owes me a few dollars for some pelts. I'll make a trip down to Oakhaven before the passes close." "The passes are closing tonight," I said bluntly. I gestured toward the window, where the snow was now driving horizontally across the glass. "You aren't getting a wagon down that grade for 3 months, not unless you want to find out how far a horse can roll." She looked toward the window, and I saw the realization hit her. The fight drained out of her shoulders, leaving her looking small in the oversized wooden chair. She closed her eyes for a long moment, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "Albert told me this was a paradise," she whispered, the bitterness leaking out. "He read some dime novel back in St. Louis about the glorious West, the open range, the clean air. He dragged me out here, built this drafty wooden box, and coughed up his lungs a year later, left me here with a dull hatchet and a mountain that wants to kill me." She opened her eyes and looked at me. There was no tears, just a quiet, terrifying clarity. "Why are you out here, Gideon?" she asked. "You don't have a dead spouse keeping you tied to a patch of dirt. You could leave. You could go down to the valley where the wind doesn't freeze the blood in your veins." "Valley's too crowded," I said. "People make noise. Mountains are quiet. You chop firewood for 2 hours in the freezing cold just to avoid a conversation." "Something like that." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She looked at my hands, calloused and thick, resting by the tin cup. Then she looked up at my face, tracing the gray in my beard, the deep lines around my eyes, the scar that ran from my cheekbone to my jaw. The corners of her mouth twitched. "You know how to fix a hinge. You know how to swing an axe. You don't talk my ear off with useless poetry about the landscape." She let out a soft, tired sigh. "Where were you 20 years ago?" The question wasn't a proposition. It was a joke born of exhaustion, a cynical acknowledgement of the cruel timing of the universe. But it hit me like a physical blow. The air in the cabin suddenly felt incredibly heavy. Where was I 20 years ago? I was 28. I was angry, violent, and stupid. I was running whiskey over the border, breaking men's jaws in muddy frontier saloons, and spending whatever money I made on cheap women and worse liquor. If 28-year-old Gideon had met Jasmine, he wouldn't have noticed her. If he had, he would have ruined her. I looked at her, meeting those pale, cracked ice eyes. 20 years ago, I said, my voice low and gravelly. I was a damn fool. I wouldn't have known what to do with a woman like you, and you would have had the good sense to shoot me if I stepped on your porch. She stared at me, the joke dying on her lips. She heard the absolute truth in my voice. The silence stretched out between us, no longer empty, but thick with the weight of the lives we had lived before we ended up marooned on this frozen ridge. She didn't look away, neither did I. Finally, she picked up her tin cup. Well, she said softly, it's a shame we both had to get old and broken to become useful. I raised my cup to hers. To being useful. I finished the bitter coffee, put my hat back squarely on my head, and stood up. Keep the damper open a 1/4 inch. I'll come back tomorrow and clean the chimney flue. I didn't wait for her to thank me. I walked out into the storm, the snow instantly blinding me, the cold wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. As I hiked up the ridge toward my own dark, empty cabin, the wind screamed through the pines, but for the first time in a decade, I didn't mind the noise. The blizzard held the mountain hostage for 3 days. It was a whiteout, a blinding, suffocating curtain of snow that erased the timberline and buried the deer trails. I spent those days holed up in my cabin, feeding the stove, mending leather gear, and listening to the wind try to tear the roof off. I should have enjoyed the solitude. It was what I lived for. But my mind was entirely ruined. It kept drifting down the ridge. I found myself staring into the flames of my stove, thinking about Jasmine's drafty walls. I caught myself wondering if she had enough dry kindling to start her morning fires, or if she was sitting at that rough-hewn table, wrapped in her dead husband's oversized coat, drinking hot water because the coffee grounds had finally given out. Where were you 20 years ago? The question echoed in the quiet of my cabin. It rattled around in my skull until I wanted to put my fist through a wall. It wasn't the romance of the question that bothered me. It was the stark, undeniable tragedy of it. 2 people, battered and scarred by bad choices and cruel circumstances, sitting across from each other in the twilight of their lives, realizing they might have actually fit together if the world hadn't gotten its hands on them first. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind died. The sky broke open, a piercing, blinding blue against the fresh, unbroken powder. I strapped on my snowshoes, took my rifle, and went hunting. The cold was absolute. It froze the moisture inside my nose the second I stepped out. I tracked a herd of elk that had bedded down in a dense thicket of spruce to survive the storm. It took me 4 hours of agonizingly slow, silent movement through waist-deep snow to get a clean angle. I dropped a young cow with a single shot behind the shoulder. She fell heavy, the heat of her life melting the snow beneath her. I worked fast. I field-dressed the carcass, my hands buried in the steaming cavity to keep my fingers from going numb. The smell of hot blood and raw meat was sharp and metallic in the crisp air. I quartered the animal, packing the heavy hindquarters and the tender backstrap into canvas sacks. I hung the rest of the meat high in a pine tree to keep it from the wolves, strapped the sacks to my pack frame, and turned not toward my cabin, but toward the draw. The trek to Jasmine's place was brutal. The heavy pack cut into my shoulders, and breaking a trail through the fresh, deep snow burned my thighs. But I didn't stop to rest. When I broke through the tree line, The sight of her cabin tightened a knot in my gut. The snow had drifted nearly to the bottom of the windows. More concerning, the barn door was swinging violently on one hinge, banging against the outer wall. I dropped the heavy pack on her porch and waded through the drifts toward the barn. Jasmine was inside, struggling to lift the massive wooden door back onto its iron pin. She was covered in snow, her breath coming in ragged gasps. A frightened bay horse was stomping nervously in the stall behind her. "Move!" I barked, stepping into the barn. She turned, startled, her foot slipping on a patch of ice. She went down hard, landing heavily on her hip. She let out a sharp cry of pain. I didn't stop to help her up. I couldn't risk the door tearing off completely. I wedged my shoulder under the heavy crossbeam of the door, planting my boots on the iced dirt floor. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the flare of pain in my bad knee, and heaved upward. The wood groaned, my spine popped, and the heavy iron hinge slid back over the pin with a heavy clack. I shoved the door shut and dropped the heavy wooden latch bar into place, sealing out the blinding glare of the snow. The barn was instantly plunged into dim, dusty twilight. The smell of old hay and horse sweat was thick in the air. I turned around. Jasmine was still on the floor, sitting up, clutching her hip. Her hat had fallen off, her graying hair a tangled mess around her face. She looked furious, embarrassed, and exhausted. "I had it," she hissed through her teeth, trying to push herself up. "No, you didn't," I said, walking over to her. I extended a massive, blood-stained hand. She looked at my hand, noting the dried elk blood on my canvas sleeves. She hesitated, her pride warring with her physical pain. Finally, with a sharp exhale, she grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. I hauled her to her feet. She swayed for a second, favoring her right leg. I didn't let go of her wrist, steadying her. We were standing close, closer than we had ever been. I could smell the stale wood smoke in her clothes and the faint, clean scent of lye soap on her skin. I could see the fine network of lines around her eyes, etched by years of squinting into the brutal mountain sun. She looked up at me, her chest heaving. "You're bleeding." "It's not mine," I said. "Shot an elk. Brought you the hindquarters." Her eyes widened slightly, the anger draining away, replaced by something entirely different. A vulnerable, aching kind of gratitude that she clearly didn't know how to process. "You brought me meat," she whispered, as if I had handed her gold. "You can't chop wood on an empty stomach," I said gruffly, letting go of her wrist and stepping back. The sudden distance felt cold. "Come on, let's get inside before your hip freezes up." We made our way slowly back to the cabin. The wind was beginning to howl again, a low, mournful sound coming down through the canyon. The brief window of clear weather was closing. Another front was moving in, the sky turning that ugly, bruised purple once more. Inside the cabin, I unloaded the meat onto the table while she limped to the stove to stoke the fire. "I'm going to have to stay," I said, looking out the window at the rapidly deteriorating sky. "I can't make it back up the ridge in this." She stopped prodding the coals and looked over her shoulder at me. The silence in the cabin stretched out, thicker and more complicated than before. The sheer physical reality of two people locked inside a 20 by 20 room while a blizzard raged outside was impossible to ignore. "I know," she said quietly. She set the iron poker down. "I'll get a skillet. We should cook the backstrap." That night, the dynamic shifted. I wasn't the gruff neighbor passing through, and she wasn't the proud widow refusing help. The storm stripped all that away. We were just a man and a woman, keeping the dark at bay. We ate the elk meat searing hot from the cast iron pan, seasoned with nothing but salt and hunger. Afterward, I pulled a flask of cheap rye whiskey from my inner coat pocket. I offered it to her. She took it, wiping the rim with her thumb, and took a long, stinging pull. She gasped, her eyes watering, and handed it back. We sat by the stove, the only light coming from the open damper. "Albert didn't know how to survive," she said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the roaring wind outside. "But he knew how to dream. He thought the world was soft. I loved him for it, but it killed him." I took a sip of the rye, letting the fire burn down my throat. "The world ain't soft, Jasmine." "No," she agreed, looking at the flickering orange light dancing on the floorboards. "It's hard and cold." She turned her head, fixing those pale eyes on me. "But it doesn't always have to be." I looked at her. I saw the exhaustion, the loneliness, the desperate need for something solid to hold on to. I saw a reflection of my own battered soul. I didn't offer any flowery promises. I didn't reach for her hand. I just looked her dead in the eye and said the truest thing I could muster. "I'll be here in the morning, Jasmine. I'll clean the flue, and I'll chop the rest of the wood." It wasn't a poem. It wasn't a grand romance. But in the bitter dark of the high country, it was the closest thing to a vow a man like me could make. And for the first time in 20 years, it felt like enough. The storm did not break the next morning. It settled over Bitterroot Ridge like an iron lid, burying the cabin under 4 feet of drift. The wind tore at the split-shake shingles, screaming through the pines with a manic, starving energy. We were marooned. I slept on the floor near the stove, using my canvas pack as a pillow. The floorboards were punishing, and the cold creeping up from the crawl space seeped into my bad knee. By the time the gray, filtered light of morning clawed its way through the frosted windows, my leg was locked tight, throbbing with a dull, sickening rhythm. I sat up, gritting my teeth, and tried to massage the joint. "Don't fight it," a voice said from the shadows. Jasmine was sitting in the oversized wooden chair, a heavy wool blanket draped over her shoulders. She had been watching me. She stood up, favoring her bruised hip, and limped over to a small wooden hutch against the far wall. She dug out a small tin and brought it back, kneeling awkwardly on the floor beside me. "Arnica and bear fat," she said, prying the lid off. The smell was sharp, medicinal, and heavy with earth. "Albert used to get terrible cramps in his calves from the cold. Roll your pant leg up." I hesitated. I wasn't used to being touched. I wasn't used to anyone giving a damn if I was in pain. But the throbbing in my knee was blinding, and her pale eyes held no room for argument. I rolled the heavy denim up past my calf. She scooped a dollop of the yellow grease onto her fingers and pressed it into my skin. Her hands were rough, the calluses scraping against my leg, but the pressure was firm and knowing. She worked the salve into the ruined tissue around my kneecap. The heat from her hands seeped into the joint, followed by the dull, numbing warmth of the arnica. Neither of us spoke. The wind battered the eastern wall, shaking the timber framing, but inside, the world had shrunk to the 3 feet of space between us. "Your knee is a mess," she said quietly, her thumb tracing the jagged white scar that hooked around the bone. "How did it happen?" "Frightened mule," I grunted. spooked by a rattlesnake down near the Cimarron Breaks. Kicked me square, shattered the kneecap. I set it myself with 2 split branches and a leather belt. She didn't wince. She just kept working the salve into the skin. Must have been a long ride to a doctor. Never went to one. Just drank a lot of whiskey and waited for the bone to knit. She stopped rubbing, her hands resting flat against my leg for a long moment. She looked up. Her hair had come loose from its braid, falling around her face in silver and dark brown strands. You're a hard man, Gideon. You don't ask for help. You don't let anyone in. It's a lonely way to survive. It keeps me alive. Alive isn't the same as living, she countered, her voice dropping to a whisper. She slowly pulled her hands away, wiping the excess grease on a rag she pulled from her pocket. I spent 5 years watching my husband try to live while he was dying. I spent the last 3 years trying to survive while I felt dead. I'm tired of it. She didn't move away. She stayed kneeling beside me. I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way her breath hitched just slightly under my gaze. I reached out. My hand was huge, scarred, and stained with dirt and old blood. I brushed a stray lock of hair away from her cheek. She didn't flinch. She leaned into the touch, closing her eyes, letting out a breath that sounded like a dam breaking. My thumb traced the sharp line of her jaw. Her skin was dry from the wind, but it felt incredibly soft underneath my calluses. She opened her eyes. They were bright, searching mine for any sign of a retreat. She found none. I moved my hand to the back of her neck, pulling her forward gently. She didn't hesitate. She closed the distance, pressing her mouth to mine. It wasn't a soft, delicate kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of arnica, stale coffee, and years of crushing isolation. She gripped the collar of my flannel shirt, her knuckles turning white, pulling me against her as if she was afraid I might turn to smoke and drift up the chimney. I wrapped my arms around her waist, feeling the fragile architecture of her ribs beneath the wool, and held her. We stayed like that for a long time, anchored to the floorboards while the mountain tore itself apart outside. We didn't make any grand declarations. We didn't promise each other the world. We just stopped pretending we didn't need each other. The rest of the day passed in a quiet, domestic rhythm that felt entirely foreign to my bones, yet strange and right. I took my hunting knife and a piece of scrap pine and whittled a set of wedges to seal the rattling window frames. Jasmine took my heavy canvas coat, which had a tear in the shoulder from the elk hunt, and sat by the stove with a needle and thick waxed thread, silently mending the canvas. We didn't talk much. We didn't have to. The silence between us had changed. It was no longer a wall built to keep the world out. It was a space we were occupying together. That night, I didn't sleep on the floor. I slept in the heavy timber bed against the far wall, under 3 layers of wool quilts. Jasmine slept beside me, her back pressed against my chest, my arm wrapped tightly around her waist. The wind howled, but for the first time in 20 years, I was completely warm. The storm finally broke on the morning of the 4th day. I woke to a blinding, crystalline silence. The wind had vanished. The air in the cabin was frigid, the fire having died down to a few glowing embers during the night. I slipped out from under the heavy quilts, careful not to wake Jasmine. I pulled on my boots and my mended coat, grabbed the iron poker, and stoked the embers, throwing 3 pieces of the split oak inside. Then I went to work. I grabbed a coil of heavy rope, a burlap sack filled with loose rocks, and my snowshoes. I stepped out onto the porch. The world was violently white. The snow had drifted up to the eaves on the windward side. I strapped the snowshoes on, waded through the waist-deep powder to the low side of the roof, and hauled myself up. The shingles were slick with frost. I moved carefully, my bad knee stiff in the biting cold, until I reached the stone chimney. Cleaning a flue is a filthy, miserable job. I dropped the weighted burlap sack down the chimney, holding the rope tight, and began to drag it up and down. The rough burlap scraped against the stone, knocking loose years of accumulated creosote and soot. Black dust plumed up into the pristine mountain air, coating my gloves, my face, and my coat. I worked the rope until the sack came up relatively clean. I peered down the dark shaft. It was clear. The stove would breathe now. I climbed down from the roof, my face smeared with black soot, looking like a coal miner fresh off a double shift. I kicked off the snowshoes and walked back inside. The cabin was already warmer. The fire I had stoked was roaring, pulling oxygen through the newly cleared flue with a steady, powerful hum. No smoke leaked from the stove door. Jasmine was up. She was standing by the stove, a pot of water already boiling, a clean rag in her hand. She took one look at me, covered head to toe in black soot, and a genuine, unburdened laugh escaped her lips. It was a beautiful sound. "You look ridiculous," she said. "Flue is clean," I grunted, setting the rope by the door. She walked over, dipped the rag into a tin basin of hot water, and wrung it out. "Hold still," she ordered. I stood there like a scolded child, while she wiped the heavy, greasy soot from my forehead, my cheeks, and the bridge of my nose. The hot water felt good against the stinging cold of my skin. She washed my face with the same focused, quiet care she had used on my knee. When she was done, she tossed the blackened rag into the basin. She looked at me, her expression sobering. The work was done. The wood was chopped. The flue was clean. The storm was over. By the laws of the mountain, it was time for me to go. I walked over to the peg by the door and took my rifle off the sling. I checked the action out of habit, then slung it over my shoulder. I picked up my heavy canvas pack. Jasmine stood by the stove, watching me. She didn't say a word, but her shoulders tightened, the rigid, jagged pride slowly creeping back into her spine. She was bracing herself, preparing for the door to close, preparing to be alone again. "I should get moving," I said, my voice rough. "The snow is deep," she replied, her tone perfectly flat, betraying nothing. "Watch your step on the scree." "I will." I reached for the iron latch of the heavy door. I lifted it, the cold air instantly biting at my ankles. I stopped. I didn't push the door open. I looked down at the floorboards, at the rough-hewn wood that Albert had laid, at the shadows cast by the roaring fire. I thought about my empty cabin up on the ridge. I thought about the silence up there, the dead, suffocating silence that I had convinced myself was peace. I turned around. Jasmine hadn't moved. She was staring at me, her breath held tight in her chest. "I've got 2 cords of seasoned hickory up at my place," I said, my voice low, "and about 50 pounds of salted pork in the root cellar." She blinked, confused. "What?" I said, "I've got a lot of wood and meat up the ridge." I let the iron latch drop. It hit the catch with a heavy, final thud. I took my hat off and tossed it onto the table. Takes a lot of work to keep 2 stoves burning on this mountain. Makes a hell of a lot more sense to just feed one. The silence in the cabin stretched thin, vibrating like a plucked wire. Jasmine stared at me, the meaning of my words slowly untangling the knot in her chest. Her eyes watered, but she refused to let the tears fall. She let out a short, wet laugh, shaking her head. You want to haul 2 cords of hickory down a mountain in 4 feet of snow just to save time? She asked, her voice cracking. I got strong mules, I said, a slow, cynical smile pulling at the corner of my scarred mouth. And I already fixed your barn door. She didn't run to me. She didn't throw her arms around my neck. That wasn't who we were. She just walked over to the table, picked up the 2 battered tin cups, and poured the last of the hot coffee. She walked over and handed me a cup. Her fingers brushed against mine. You better go get your mules, Gideon, she said softly. Before it gets dark. I took the cup, took a sip of the bitter coffee, and looked at the woman who had finally anchored me to the earth. I'll be back by sundown, I promised, and for the first time in my life, I couldn't wait to come home. If you made it to the end of Gideon and Jasmine's story, hit that like button and subscribe for more original tales. Survival isn't always about fighting the elements. Sometimes it's about letting someone else help you carry the load. Share this video with a friend who appreciates a romance built on grit, calluses, and mutual respect, rather than fairy tales. Drop a comment below. What's the toughest storm you've ever had to weather, and who helped you through it? We'll see you in the next one.